Hello, Year 8. This is Mr. Collinson, and I'm here to talk to you this morning about why people migrate from one place to another. Now, your project work focuses on migration and examples of migration, and then uses Syria as an example of immigration. So really what I want to focus on today is the following. The big question is, what are the causes and impacts of migration? Now, this topic often uncovers a host of new phrases, terminology and vocabulary that you may or may not be familiar with, and therefore the aim of this PowerPoint is to focus your attention on some key terms and to focus on sub-question 1, looking specifically at migration itself, but then linking it to push and pull factors, and then some clarification of some more complex geographical vocabulary. So, just before we get started, I feel it's pertinent to start thinking about migration as a word, because often when people talk about migration, they talk about migration as in international migration, because what they see and hear on the news. Migration, as you should all be familiar with, is not as simple and straightforward as that. Migration is not just about crossing international borders. So the next few questions are designed to get you to think about migration as a word as opposed to what you see in the media. So what I suggest before we start is that you make sure you have a pen, pencil and some paper to make notes on, to write on. I will be asking you to make notes and to write answers to certain questions. So if you make sure that is available, then we can move on. So what I suggest you do, if you haven't got them to hand, is if you pause the PowerPoint now and then go away, get what you need, and you can restart it. So, hopefully by now you have all the equipment that you need, ready to move on. So, a few questions just to get your brain juices flowing. So, have you ever moved countries? Have you ever moved regions? For example, the northeast, the northwest, the southeast, the southwest. Have you ever moved house? Now, if you have answered yes to any of those three things, then you are a migrant. You have migrated, because migration is not necessarily crossing international borders. Migration is quite simply the movement from one place to another. Now, migration isn't exclusive to people. Animals migrate. For example, some birds that live in this country during the summer migrate to North Africa for the winter period to avoid the colder weather. For example, the ruddy duck. We focus our attention mainly on migration because of what we see in the news. We often see pictures, certainly more recently, of large waves of people migrating from often hostile and war-torn regions to the UK or to Central Europe. But migration can happen within a country in addition to from one country to another. So when someone moves within a country, this is what we refer to as internal migration. Now, internal migration is something that I have done myself. I moved from Carlisle to Newcastle for work purposes. I did not leave the United Kingdom. I stayed within the United Kingdom borders, and therefore it is internal migration. Whereas I know my sister-in-law She moved from Carlisle and she now lives and works in Barcelona. Therefore, she is an international migrant as opposed to an internal migrant. So, just to get us moving on a little bit, I'd like you on your paper to decide which sentence is which type of migration. I will give you a moment's pause in between each to allow you time to think and to consider. The answer for 1, 2 or 3 are on the orange box on the left hand side of the slide. First one, what type of migration is this? Philip moved from Russia or Romania to the UK in 2008 in search of a better job. Is that internal migration, international migration, or is that not migration? Write your answer now. Number 2. Every summer, Mr. and Mrs. Hall go on holiday to Spain. Is that internal migration, international migration, or is that not migration? And finally, number 3. Peter and Mary moved from Newcastle to the coastal village of Seahouses for peace and quiet. Is that internal migration, international migration, or is that not migration? Okay, hopefully you have an answer for each one. I'll go through the answers now so you can self-assess your work to see if you have the general idea before we move on to more complicated situations. The first one, where somebody is moving from Romania to the UK, they have crossed an international border. So hopefully you have discovered that that is international migration. Every summer, Mr. and Mrs. Hall, that is a holiday. Holidays are temporary, they are not permanent, and therefore that is not a form of migration, but rather tourism. And finally, number 3, moving from Newcastle to Seahouses. This is staying within the borders of the UK, and therefore that would be internal migration. So give yourself a mark out of 3. Hopefully we are all absolutely on the money and getting 3 out of 3. But before we move on, I'd like us to think about the extension at the bottom. So we've talked about internal, international migration, but there is another phrase called urban to rural migration and rural to urban migration. Now, the two words, urban meaning town or city and rural meaning countryside, it therefore makes life a bit easier to understand that phrase. So in this country, we have a trend of people moving from the city to rural areas for a peaceful, quieter, less polluted environment. But equally, we have people moving into urban areas for work purposes and for social and entertainment purposes. So let's think about key terms. I won't expect you to write them all down because in the time it takes me to talk through them, you may not have the opportunity to write them down. However, you may want to pause the PowerPoint at this stage to refer back to these key terms if you are struggling with any of them within your project work. So I will go through them very quickly to make sure that you have an idea, but you can use this glossary as your reference point for future work on your projects. If someone is to emigrate, they leave a country, and if somebody is to immigrate, they are to move into a country. We often see these two words used. We often see the word immigration as a result of what is happening in this country. It is certainly a hot topic in political conversations, and it is certainly in most political parties' manifestos. It is a topic which has been in the news a lot, certainly in the last 3-4 years. and it is something that people often talk about in a negative way. However, we need to explore the other possibilities and the other positives that migrants do bring in and out of countries. A migrant, as we discussed, is someone who moves. International, we've talked about in terms of crossing international borders. That does not include Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland, because they are still part of the United Kingdom. However, if you moved to the Republic of Ireland, then you would be international, as that is a separate nation. Rural to urban, we talked about countryside and cities and what towns and cities have to offer and what rural environments have to offer. And the two words at the bottom, I feel, are the ones that are often most significantly confused and often got wrong as a result of media, but also as a result of them being used interchangeably in the media and in different circles. So let me just give you some clarification of what they actually mean. A refugee is somebody who is forced to leave an area. Now, you may be a refugee for a variety of reasons. It may be because of persecution, political differences. There is a thing these days called a climate change refugee, or it may be because of war or other indifferences or intolerances around the world. A refugee is somebody who is forced to leave an area. You can be a refugee within your own country if you have moved from one region to another. Certainly in some locations around the world, people are not leaving their country, but they are going to certain parts of their country as they are forced to leave. Whereas an asylum seeker is different. An asylum seeker is a political status. An asylum seeker is somebody who enters a country and seeks asylum. Asylum is political refuge. Now, in this country, if somebody enters the country and claims asylum, they would have to be, or they would be able, or have to be able to prove that if they were to remain in the country of their origin, then they would be subject to significant harm, and therefore they need protection from another country. So hopefully those key terms have helped clarify a couple of things, maybe challenge some misconceptions, and hopefully now when you use those terms, you use them in the correct context, and certainly without prejudice, and certainly so you can articulate things in a more clear and concise fashion. So, why do people migrate? There are several reasons for migration. However, there are two broad categories that you should be familiar with from previous lessons, and I would like you to just write down briefly the definitions of the two broad categories, so then when we go on to further slides you can refer back to them and develop your knowledge. So the first category are push factors. So if you think about the word push, it is something that would make you want to leave a place. So when I left Carlisle, the push factor was that there were limited job opportunities and therefore I had little opportunity for progression. So it forced me away, it made me want to leave Carlisle. Whereas the other broad category is pull factors. Pull factors are something, as the word suggests, it pulls you, it draws you to a location. So people like things about a location and that makes them want to live there. So the pull factor for Newcastle for me was that it would provide more job opportunities with better pay, better opportunity for progression, but also with the universities and the nightlife and entertainment, it would provide a future for my family as well. So I'm just going to give you a moment to write down those two definitions so we can then move on to start thinking about examples of each. Okay, hopefully now you've got those definitions down, and we'll start to explore them a little bit more fully with examples. So you can do two things. You can either copy the table completely, or you can list them underneath the relevant headings. I'm more than happy for you to do it any which way you find preferable. There are a significant number of examples, but before we look at the examples, I'd like you to consider that those examples would fall into other categories as well, such as social, economic, environmental, and political. Now, before we move on to those subcategories, I'd like us to just consider some of the other factors listed by the bullet points and put them under the correct column heading. So which of those factors are push and which of those factors are pull? So which of those factors would force me away from an area and which of those factors would attract me to an area? I've populated the table with two for examples for you to follow, but I will give you now a couple of minutes and I would like you to try and get 3 in each column to give you a good example to then help support you when you look at your project work with the example of Syria. So that's 3 in addition to the 2 I've already put in. So where would you put flooding? Where would you put the area is not safe, poor healthcare, lots of crime, drought, good climate, poverty, war, safe and less crime, crop failure, low risk from natural hazards like earthquakes, volcanoes, flooding, and an area with lots of doctors. So populate the table with 3 more push factors and 3 more pull factors. I will give you just a couple of moments to try and get your head around that, and then what I will do is I will go down the list and tell you whether that is a push or a pull, so you can self-assess your work to see if you have managed to get the idea and to see whether or not you are comfortable with the 2 terms before we move on to the sub-classification. Okay, don't worry if you're not quite finished. If you're not quite finished, I would suggest you pause the PowerPoint now to give you opportunity to complete the examples. But I will move on and I will give you the answers now. But if you do want to obviously pause it, go ahead and do that now. Okay, so let's look at the examples and let's place them in the table. Flooding. Well, if you were in an area that had consistent flooding, like Bangladesh, then you may want to leave that area. Therefore, flooding would be a push factor. If an area is not safe, it may be as a result of war, crime, persecution, prejudice, then again, that would make you want to leave the area, and therefore that would be a push factor. Poor healthcare systems would be a push factor because you would be limited in your ability to access doctors. And if the area has lots of crime and drought, then those 2 would also be push factors. However, those of you who have been a little bit more savvy and switched on may have realised that there is some order to them to help you out. If we have an area of good climate, now the climate, you may think, oh, that's good, you can sunbathe, it's not just about that. Climate can attract tourists to an area, which can generate money. Climate can allow you to grow crops, to have a successful agricultural system. And climate can affect your mental health. So you may want to move to an area with a good climate. So the good climate would be a pull factor. Poverty. Poverty is where people do not have the means to live and they do not get their basic needs met. And therefore, that would possibly make you want to leave an area to seek better opportunities in other locations. That would be a push factor. War is pretty self-explanatory. You wouldn't want to be in a location of war, so that would be a push factor. Safe and less crime. Well, I would definitely want to move somewhere that I felt safe and that there weren't large-scale crime issues, so that would be a pull factor. However, crop failure, which is an issue in certain parts of the world, certainly in more arid regions in Central Africa, and then we have issues in certain parts of the world like India and Bangladesh as a result of monsoons, where the crops don't grow and therefore you are unable to feed yourself and your family. Therefore, that would be a push factor. Low risk from natural hazards. Yep, I can't imagine anybody here would want to live on the side of a volcano or in a known earthquake zone. Very dangerous, very hazardous, and therefore you would want to move away from that area. So therefore you would want to move to an area of low risk, which would be a pull factor. And finally, if you know an area has lots of doctors and lots of access to medical care and medical interventions, then that might attract you to an area. So that would be a pull factor. Now, the subcategories of social, economic, environmental and political are quite straightforward. Each one of those bullet points could be placed into a subcategory. The terms social, economic, environmental and political are quite straightforward. Social is anything to do with people, their lives. So, for example, education. Social is something to do with healthcare, so it could be linked to doctors. Economic is anything to do with money, so that could be your salary, your income, the cost of housing, the cost of living, better jobs. Environmental is anything to do with the environment in which you live, so that could be to do with disease, pollution, climate change. And political is anything to do with government decisions or government policy, so that would include war. So I'm going to give you a moment. I suggest you now pause the PowerPoint and use the information in the table and attempt to subclassify the bullet points. So are they examples of social, economic, environmental and political? If you pause the PowerPoint now, and you can continue with that task, and then I will go through the answers in just a moment. Okay, now hopefully you've come back to us after pausing it, so you should have completed that task. The answers are as follow. Flooding, flood risk, and flooding in areas. Large-scale flooding is to do with the environment, so that would be an environmental push factor. An area that is not safe, well, that's a bit broad. If we take that as not safe for a variety of reasons, so in actual fact it could be not safe for a social reason, not safe for an environmental reason, or not safe for a political reason. So you may need to kind of think about other examples. Poor healthcare is about people, it's about their health, so that would be social. Crime is to do with people and criminal activity, again, social. Drought is the absence of water, and therefore that would be environmental. Good climate, again, environmental. Poverty is to do with people, but also to do with their economic status. So you could argue that would be social and economic. War is a political movement. Safe and less crime, as we've discussed, is social. Crop failure is as a result of climatic variables, so that would be environmental. Natural hazards, again, environmental. And doctors and access to doctors would be social. So hopefully by now you've managed to get your head round push and pull factors, but also how you could subclassify those push and pull factors into subcategories of social, economic, environmental and political. Just before we reconnect with our project work, I thought I would explore some different types of migration just quickly. You can refer back to this by pausing the PowerPoint in future if you wish to do so, but it just may help you understand it in a little bit more detail. So we have economic migration. So these are the reasons why people would leave. We talked about this with push and pull factors, but this is just for clarification of those key terms, just to make sure you have a point of reference for when you complete your tasks. So going back to our original sub-question, why do people migrate, push and pull factors? By now you should be able to define refugee, define asylum seeker and define economic migration. That should be pretty straightforward. You should be able to give ideas of why people may want to migrate either within a country or across international borders. And then Miss Hawthorne will start looking at the positive and negatives of migration, and then Mr. McAvoy will start looking at the case study of Syria to allow you to explore that in more depth. But when you now look through this research and evidence, you should be able to pick out the reasons why people left Syria, as in the push factors. Okay, so at that moment in time they were refugees being forced to leave the area, as we know from our key terms. So you should be able to identify those reasons from the yellow box in the text. You should be able to make a reasonable suggestion about why the poverty in Syria is making migration more difficult. You should be able to think about, well, if people have limited money and limited resources, why might that make migration more difficult? You should be able to now look at those two videos on migration on YouTube and be very able to clearly outline what a push factor is and what a pull factor is. And you should now be very able to go through the examples and be able to provide economic, political, environmental, social, cultural push and pull factors. You should be then very able to link a push factor from Syria and then start thinking about pull factors from the European Union into the UK. So the more likely examples you will have heard from, as it is the third largest ethnic group in the UK, is Polish migration. But we have also experienced migration historically in the 50s and 60s from Asia, and then in the 50s and 60s from the Windies. And you may have heard of the Windrush generation. It's been in the news more recently. So what is it about the UK which attracted people to it? What is it about the UK that would make people want to come here from their country of origin? That's it from me, folks. Hopefully that has solved a few queries. Hopefully that has enabled you to tackle the tasks more fully. And hopefully if you haven't had any misunderstandings or misconceptions, it's allowed you to explore them more fully, and it has solved a couple of riddles for you. I've been Mr. Collinson. Thank you very much, and I'll see you all in the autumn term.